welcome to the third annual Coin Corner. This is the Research and Creative Activity Conference for the College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences. And our next presenter, well, our first presenter today is Jeremy Privatira, who is a Social Studies secondary education major. That's not right.
Bachelor's of Arts History and International Studies minor.
That's right. I think something got copied wrong.
I changed my major.
Okay, that's what it is then. You said it best though. His presentation is entitled Foreigners, Abolitionists, and Catholics, Anti-Catholicism in Antebellum Arkansas. And this was an essay written for the History 2320 course, Intro to Historical Research with Dr. Kim Little, who wrote to us about Jeremy. She said it's simply amazing that he is here to present today, given that his home was hit by the March 31st tornado. He was without power for 8 days and without internet for 15 days, aside from that obvious devastation. So please welcome Jeremy and all of the hard work that he's done to get right here to present today.
Thank you all very much. Like she said, my name is Jeremy Privatira, and I am a Bachelor's of Arts in History nowadays. So anti-Catholicism in Arkansas is a very interesting topic. First off, because we're going to go from the bottom side up, Catholicism was always and still is a minority in Arkansas, about 2 to 4% of the population at any given time. There are two themes we're going to see emerge through examining the newspapers of the time. It's Catholicism is foreign, and Catholicism, because it's foreign, can even be subversive. On top of this, the period we're covering here is 1819 to 1860. So Arkansas Territory is formed, including what we could consider today Oklahoma, in 1819, and the Civil War really begins in 1860, or starts to be in 1860. For secondary research, two big books: A History of Catholicism in Pre-Civil War Arkansas, History of the Catholic Church in Arkansas by James and Wood, and The Beginning of the Catholic Church in Arkansas by Father F.G. Hallwick. Newspaper.com was used to conduct all the primary research of this. It pulled up about 1,600 results, and I read almost all of them. A lot of newspapers went into this. So, before we begin, let's talk about Arkansas before America. Of course, the question is, how do you get from a Catholic nations owning Arkansas, France and Spain, to anti-Catholicism in the majority Protestant state? Well, the fact of the matter is that the European population of Arkansas was always incredibly small. It was never Arkansas town or Arkansas city. It was Arkansas post. And of course, we see that it wasn't even formed until well after the Louisiana Purchase. So, we begin not in 1819, as you would expect, but 1844, after the defeat of presidential candidate Henry Clay, the Whig member. The article of in the Arkansas Gazette, there was an article published about his defeat. In it, they were quoted as saying, "If foreigners, abolitionists, and Catholics had not voted in a body against us, we," meaning the Whigs, "would have won." This article in 1844 represents growing pre-Civil War anti-Catholic sentiment that had been festering for some time in Arkansas. The idea of Catholicism being a foreign religion, possibly antithetical to democracy, permeated many newspapers of the time, and eventually we'll see that these ideas are used by a small majority to attempt to exploit Arkansans and gain power. But for the first 3 years of Arkansas history, we see very little references to Catholicism. Actually, for 3 years, really the only thing we see is the title His Catholic Majesty, a title for the King of Spain at the time, referring to the Louisiana Purchase. It was reprinted in the Arkansas Post newspaper at the time. The first time Catholics as a group were talked about is in fact the August 13th, 1822 edition, which you see in the second bullet point there, Report on Mexico and Catholicism. This was a report actually about what we consider today Texas. So if you're not a fan of Texas, you might agree with the sentiment. Talked about a place of horrific and bleak starvation with undrinkable cow's milk. And especially, none but Catholics are permitted to settle, and slavery is expressly prohibited. So this article we're going to see sets up major themes about Catholicism. It's that foreign, and it's even corrupting to the nation. We're going to see an interesting thing here again about in 1844, again a report about Mexico, and probably what we would consider today Texas actually. The quote reads as follows: "The Mexicans have made only small advances in republicanism. This is evident by their acceptance only of the Catholic religion." Now in 1844, we see an advertisement for a Vade Mecum. This is a misprint. This is supposed to be a Vade Mecum, which is a Catholic handbook used. But obviously, there are probably no Catholics at the post to actually spell check this. So instead of saying, go to your handbook, this says, go away mucus. So, in 1824 onwards into the 30s, we're seeing mostly the foundation of Catholic nations. So South America, if I'm permitted to use an anachronistic term here, is beginning to balkanize. We see we see nations like Chile being formed, especially, and it's especially clear that they were not pleased about the formation of Chile because it was a Catholic exclusive nation. They were not so peeved about England being a Protestant-only nation. In fact, the Gazette, the same one who published the report about Mexico, or as we call it today, Texas, quoted phrases such as, "The Protestant established would be confirmed in its strength, and the course of government was about to pursue would put down and prevent the growth of popery altogether." Of course, popery is a derogatory term for Catholicism. This was from the Duke of Newcastle at the time, speaking about Catholic emancipation in Great Britain. As well, we see remarks such posted by Presbyterian minister Dr. Thomas Chandler. Chandler's view was that religious tolerance was good, not really because getting along with your fellow man is good, mostly because he believed that if Protestants just made friends with the Catholics would see their error of their ways and become Protestant. He in fact said that oppression was preventing them from, quote, assailing the strongholds of popery, and specifically said, "We are not pro-Catholic," speaking for his party. In the same title of the Gazette, in their increasingly tolerant, read intolerant ways, the Gazette describes a Catholic Requiem Mass, which of course before 1964, all Catholic services were conducted in Latin. The sacred prayers of the Mass he described as something nobody fully understood, and talking about other very charitable remarks such as ladies having to stand and sit on the floor while gentlemen sit on the front pews. It's evident that to this author, the Latin and the prayers of the Catholic Church were just as foreign as the religion. So despite what you're going to read and be presented about the taking over of Catholics in America, Catholicism actually was very, very small at the time. 2.3% of the state's population in 1830. 89% of these was what we would consider Arkansas Post, and Jefferson County mainly centered around what we call today Pine Bluff. The Whig Party displayed, again, more anti-Catholicism, and we would see the Whigs turn into the know-nothings later. But the Whigs described the abolition of the Society of Jesus in France due to the Revolution as one of the first and most glorious triumphs achieved by public opinion. Of course, they apologized for this later. About 6 years later, in fact, they issued an apology saying, "We have clouded our articles with the vile dregs of material fit for agitation and public information." That didn't really stop them too much, but it's nice they apologized. In fact, later they would present several anti-Catholic articles, as with other newspapers, most notably of these being of Maria Monk of the Hotel de Montreal, who was a fake nun in Montreal and claimed to have seen many horrific things. This was definitely quite the stir, as when it was discovered, there was at least seven articles dedicated to debunking her and republishing that debunking. But despite all this, remarkably the same year, 1836, a collection was taken up among Arkansans for the construction of what we call today St. Andrew's Cathedral. More Protestants donated to the construction of St. Andrew's Cathedral than Catholics did. In fact, twice as many, and they almost raised twice as much money. 8 Protestants to $400, 4 Catholics to $250. Don't mistake this as meaning Arkansas was some bastion of religious tolerance. In fact, the Weekly Arkansas Gazette, who put so eloquently about their inflammatory articles, then proceeded to republish in 1841 a Whig article protesting Irish immigration as the children of bigoted Catholic Ireland sent out as a plague to America. And this was not a very positive article towards the Irish Catholics. But we do see other things which contribute to why the South might not like Catholicism. Have the words in Supremo Apostolus in the bottom of there. That is the decree condemning slave slavery conducted by the Pope at the time and condemning slavery itself. In 41, we see, in the 40s and 50s, we see questions of Catholic loyalty. 41, the first ever pro-Catholic article is published defending the Catholic Educational Institute, not as something to essentially educate subversives and convert Protestants, but good education on its own merit and not wanting to convert, just out to convert people and overthrow the nation, essentially. 1844, we start seeing quotes, again, like we saw at the presentation, foreigners, abolitionists, and Catholics about the overthrow of the election. We're also seeing now questions of, can Catholics be loyal to America? The Mexican-American War was going on. Mexico is and was at that time still a predominantly Catholic nation. In the late 40s, we see the Italian Wars of Reunification, where the Papal States at the time were actively opposing a republic formation. So there's a lot of questions about, can Catholics be loyal when the head of their church is at war with the republic? Now, we get to 1854. We're going to gloss over those about 24 years here, just because while these years are necessary, let's say if you were to be conducting a thorough examination of journalism at this time, they're not necessarily needed to understand the anti-Catholic sentiments, though there's a wealth of information in there, and I would highly encourage you, if you're interested in this, to go back and read some of these articles from that time. Now, 1854, we see the Know-Nothings come out. Now, the Know-Nothings are a kind of a brainchild of the most extreme Whigs imaginable. They're anti-Catholic, they're anti-foreign. February, we see them come out. They have explosive growth. So explosive growth, in fact, by June of that year, they're being implicated in bombing Catholic churches. Same year, later on, we're seeing the Know-Nothing Charter printed in Arkansas newspapers. Now, Article 2 of the Know-Nothings specifically mentions Catholicism. It calls the Catholic Church subversive and says that the Catholic Church, if unsuppressed, will lead to the overthrow of the American Constitution. And they have what's called the Catholic test, which Albert Pike, who will be very important to the movement in Arkansas, was a supporter of. Now, here, Albert Pike was the leader of the Know-Nothings in Arkansas by far. However, we have 3 main figures to identify. Albert Pike, who is their leader, he acts as the political espouser of this. Solon Borland, who was a former United States Senator for Arkansas and ambassador to Nicaragua. He actually was kicked out from being ambassador because he said to Nicaragua, "Would you like to become a state? Because that's what I'd like to see you do." And then we have James Yell, who has no pictures of him on the internet. He basically lived and died without ever being photographed. Now, as we see here, Solon Beauregard is a crusader against Catholicism. James Yell, if you recognize that last name, was the nephew of Archibald Yell, and said that he would like to reenact the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre on Catholics, which, if you're familiar with the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, is a massacre of Huguenots in France, women, children, and men. And if Albert Pike sounds familiar to you, oh, by the way, all three of these people went on to be generals in the Confederate Army during the Civil War. And if you're familiar with the name Albert Pike, this is Albert J. Pike Memorial Temple, located at 700 to 724 Scott Street in Little Rock, Arkansas, found in 1917. 1855, we start to really see the know-nothings get into Arkansas. The newspapers are taking battle lines. The Weekly Arkansas Gazette starts to be the know-nothing paper. The True Democrat starts to defend Catholics. At one point, the Weekly Gazette calls the True Democrat owned by the clergy and the Catholic wing of the press. Washington Telegraph is kind of just an opportunist in this time. They start out as very pro-foreigner. They denounce the know-nothings when they first occur, and then later they begin printing articles questioning the loyalty of Catholics. Now, here's where it gets interesting, and here's where a lot of people get very involved very quickly. Late 1855, the legislature convenes, and they vote on resolutions on know-nothingery, or know-nothingism, as the case may be. They specifically call know-nothing anti-American and unconstitutional, and furthermore illegal. This is the empowerment of the Democratic Party in Arkansas, because the Democrats really, the True Democrat, of course, the newspaper, was a Democratic paper. This denouncement of the know-nothings, the main opponent of Democrats in Arkansas, really sets them off. In November of that same year, the legislature meets in October. In November, the Democratic Convention happens. Thomas Fletcher, who would become President pro tempore of the Arkansas Senate and future acting governor of Arkansas, is one of the staunchest defenders of Catholicism. We have something called SAMs. These are, for the purpose of this, these are people who wrote ghostwriters for the Know-Nothing Party, who would ghostwrite under the name of Sam, and people would appear against the name Sam. And this was, of course, Uncle Sam, because the Know-Nothings also called themselves the American Party. So Sam started coming out, publicly announcing their names and denouncing the Know-Nothing Party. April 1856, Pike leaves the party. He actually leaves the state for some time after this. James Yell, who of course said he'd like to go ahead and massacre some Catholics, loses to Conway by quite a margin, over about 25% to 75%. And most importantly, Millard Fillmore, know-nothing candidate, fails to be elected. He gets one state, and the Democratic candidate wins. So 56, the know-nothings are disgraced. 57, people start to see the decline. We see a movement from Catholicism in America to Catholicism in Europe. And we, of course, see some, I guess you would call it election denial nowadays. But really this dies off at 59. And by 59, the Weekly Arkansas Gazette, the most staunch anti-Catholic newspaper, is printing articles about Catholic books and Catholic lecture series. And they even attend a fundraiser at a Catholic church and publish it in their newspaper. In kind of closing things up, one of the final references in 1860 is to His Catholic Majesty about George Washington and the King of Spain at the time. So it all came kind of full circle there. So we really see here that the Protestant majority stepped up and defended a minority in Arkansas. Even today, Catholics only make up about 4% of the population of Arkansas. Here it's 2 to 3%, and these are not the wealthiest individuals. These are the poorest individuals. This is a case of a majority rejecting persecution and standing up for a minority in Arkansas. It's also incredibly poorly documented by historians, and I have some recommended readings up here about the actors involved in this if you're interested more in this topic. But this has been Anti-Catholicism in Pre-Civil War Arkansas. My name is Jeremy Previtera, and thank you very much for coming to this presentation.